Okay, we're back. So I'm doing part 2 of this great consciousness debate from the ASSC, Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. And we're just in the first part of this debate talking about Victor Lama's view that there are conscious experiences, that phenomenally conscious, what is likeness that you don't know about. And so they've been pressing him on this. And so now we're getting further pressings on this. So let's jump right back in. This is right where we left off.
And part of that has something to do with, if you say that, for instance, the experience is unified, right? But then you say that, well, in the experience of the gorilla, for instance, you see something black, but you don't know that is a gorilla. Then what is the unification there even, right? Because, you know, and let me finish with that, just so that I can press you, so then you explain us, when you say like, you saw something, then what is, because I think this is the part of the divide, so to speak, you know, between all theories, right? You would say, well, I see a gorilla, you know, and that actually has a, you know, particular organization, a particular structure. I understand it some way, right? So,
I mean, when I talk about...
So hold on. So the unity of consciousness, I think he means how experiences are bound to a unified whole. And the idea is that the recurrent processing has something to do with that. Binding different parts of the experience together, maybe, or something. Where she's talking about the unity of it as being a whole experience of the gorilla. And he's saying, well, there's an experience of like the black shape, but then later an interpretation of it, applying cement as you know, concepts to it as being a gorilla, and etc. So I think that's a different kind of unity.
The unified percept is unified in the visual sense.
And that's exactly what I'm trying to understand. So what does unification, because here's where we're going to start seeing some of the divides, right? If you can think that it is unified is because it's structured. So for instance, if I see like black and white dots, it's exactly the same as if I see something else, because in principle it's structured, right? And that's it, it's unified, right? Then, you know, you may say, well, it's not the same as if I actually see a gorilla versus if I see black and white, right? So in your case, where are you in that?
Sorry, I'm not sure.
Where do you draw the line? Where does it become unified? When it's an object that you can segregate, let's say, from the background, or what?
What makes it then conscious? You know, that I'm trying to understand.
Well, it's the visual phenomenon where all the elements that make up a visual scene are integrated into some sort of coherent whole, where indeed you have figure ground.
Right, because you have the different aspects of the shape. You have its color. You have its location. You have how bright it is. Whether it's made of something furry or soft, or solid or translucent. All of those things are what get unified into it. It's over there. So that doesn't need to be, it's a gorilla as well. It's an object. That's what he's saying. It's a visual percept. But you don't, maybe on his view, you don't see the gorilla-ness. Some people do claim that you can see these sorts of things, that they're part of the visual properties that are produced by the visual system. But that seems like a separate issue than the one that we were discussing before, right? I don't know.
Where you have objects and stuff, and you know, and where we have this, well, what we call unified percept, but it's devoid of any cognitive associations that you may have with that. I mean, then it transcends being unified in the visual sense.
So Rami, I see what great discussion your question already brought up. So let's move to who wants to be next to say what's the most important criticism, in your opinion, that your theory should account for?
They're letting him off the hook. Okay, so he didn't really address the question. I think what he was saying was that this thing she's talking about, it goes beyond it being a merely visual thing into concepts. Yeah, so they didn't really press him on what does a unification mean, because they could have asked, like, how does recurrent feedback actually try to explain that? So yeah, that would have been interesting to hear.
Victor was brave to be the first.
Right, and very honest.
Yeah.
I can go for myself. I think there's so many deficiencies. I think, first of all, we wouldn't need to have such a debate if these were actual theories. We should be very modest, I think. I wouldn't need to sit here. There would be the theory, everybody could work with it. So I think we're lacking formalization of these theories, first and foremost. And we started to do some mini simulations, but they are really minuscule. we're trying to flesh this out a little bit, this simulation with Xiaojing Wang at the moment and many other colleagues to have at least more realistic equations for how cortical tissue should behave and so on and so forth. But we have to be honest, these are very, the beginning of an attempt of a theory, I would say. Really.
So what the missing part is moving.
What's the objection to the global neural workspace that would be most pressing? He hasn't answered that.
From description to explanation to mechanism.
To mechanism, yeah. The mechanistic part is really weak, and I think that's why I welcome so much, for instance, Matthew Larkham's beautiful experiment where they are fleshing out the actual dendritic mechanism and the layers in which this could be occurring and so on and so forth.
And if we stick to G and W in your case, so what would that jump be? What is that quantum leap in terms of, what would take the explanation to the mechanism in your case?
Well, I think I say that. I think it would be going down to a much more reductionist view of the actual computer. Maybe there are two different axes where we could go. I sort of see it now. One, which we are trying to take, is to really go to the actual synaptic, dendritic, layer, laminar computations, and to be much more precise about what should be occurring there. Another would be to be much more precise about the types of computation that should be put in a machine. That was the purpose of this paper. We try to say to provoke the people who actually do, machine learning and so on about what.
I think this paper he's talking about is the one he wrote with Haquan Lau on machine consciousness, where they say if you build these two properties into machines, they'll be conscious. So one is a global workspace, and the other is this kind of perceptual reality monitoring system that Haquan likes. In other words, some kind of higher order system. So interesting.
Missing in their systems. And I have discussions with Yann Lequin, with Joshua Bengio about what could be done there. But nobody exactly knows how to turn these nice ideas of the global workspace into an actual computational system.
So let me even ask something in that spirit, but one step behind. So even we're...
Oh, pardon me. Oh, sneezy. Whoa, Zyrtec. Zyrtec just wore off. What happened? Wait, did I forget to take my Zyrtec this morning? I think I forgot to take it. Holy moly. Wow, that was sudden.
When we're still talking about the more abstract level, what does that really mean when there is a broadcasting of information in the sense? So let's say that I saw a face, and now the global workspace broadcasts that information throughout the brain, and now a neuron in the auditory cortex gets the information that I saw a face. Like, how does it work? Yes. How does it work in the brain, in your opinion?
Well, I wish I could flesh it out, but
That's a good question. I wish someone would flesh it out, because people talk about these things being the same and then being mobilized into the workspace, when really the neurons stay where they are. So how does the information go from here to there? Well, the representations must somehow be the things which are transmitted. There does need to be a mechanistic story. So this is interesting, that the idea that we don't really know how this stuff is implemented in the brain is the biggest objection to the global workspace theory, or how to implement it computational or neurally. Interesting.
The vision I have is that you have all these cell assemblies that have a certain vector state. I insist, it's not just in prefrontal cortex, but in a distributed system. So they have enough axons to send the information to virtually any other brain processor in a rich format, such that each of the processors receive the sort of barcode, a signature of this higher level state. And they may be able to use it or not. If it's completely different from the code that they are working with, it may just be treated as noise, right? It looks like noise. And this may actually explain why there are so many spikes that look like noise in the nervous system. But if by learning the receiving area can learn to use that receiving code, say, oh, it's meaningful to me, it means a prior, I should change my state, and so on, then you begin to have an interesting system where the processors can use this information, send it back. And I think that's what Bernie Bars had in mind. Basically, you broadcast, some processors can use the information and complete and send information back to the workspace, and you have a sort of virtuous loop like that. But for many...
Yeah, but there's different ways of interpreting that. So one way is like Bars kind of had like what he called a blackboard architecture, where all this stuff is sent to a central area, and then other systems access that store. Whereas you might think that what the global workspace is just connecting modules directly, like a series of tubes that connects the visual area to the speech area like directly, so that there's no central area where everything gets rewritten, so to speak, on a blackboard. There's just a massive amount of interconnections between modules. So it's not clear how to, even from what he's saying here, how to interpret that metaphor. But
processors, it's just noise.
But it also means that these processors are supposed to be able to understand like a huge amount of barcodes, so to speak.
Yes, but
outside of their own kind of processing.
Yeah, but they can learn to do so, and again, many of them may look like noise. But it also means that there is no need for one unified language of the brain, which I think was always a criticism of the workspace idea. You know, what's the language that allows all these areas to talk together? Well, in fact, the synapses that move the information from one area A to the area B change also the format of representation, right? And allow you, and we've learned that from neural networks, allow you to transform the information to a new format that can be used by the receiving area.
Let me take that conversation back to Victor in some sense. Because, in the case of Stan, he's making the point that the prefrontal cortex is sending this barcode to say, like, sensory areas, right? In your case, you're saying something slightly similar in some sense, but it just has to be local, right? Because if I'm a neuron before, I don't really quite know whether, like I'm getting input, like from IT or where I'm getting input from, prefrontal cortex or what have you, right? So, ultimately, if I'm a neuron before, I have no idea. So, and if I am a neuron before, then how do I know that, like I'm conscious or I'm not conscious?
Yeah.
Right. So I guess the idea is so the neurons, V4 is an area that processes color. So Victor's going to say, local feedback to there is probably where color experience in the brain is located or originates or something like that. Her point is the neurons there can't tell whether they're getting feedback long range from the prefrontal cortex, like someone like Dahan would predict, or whether it's short range from other areas in the visual cortex, like Victor would predict. So there are those connections, but the neuron itself doesn't know. So her question is, how is the neuron supposed to know whether it should be conscious or not?
Well, to some extent, of course, this relates to the whole issue of representation. Indeed, a neuron is firing action potentials. Yeah, okay. Well, what does this actually mean? Now, of course, in neuroscience, we generally have adopted this idea that, if, for example, a neuron is tuned to orientation, this is a representation of orientation. Whether that's true or not, it's mostly a philosophical issue that I will shy away from. But that's the idea. Now, so you have these neurons which are representing a particular orientation, and then you have these neurons which are representing whether it's a face or not, and et cetera, et cetera. And then, by means of these recurrent interactions, and that's indeed, I mean, that's where mechanisms indeed become very important. Somehow this process of perceptual organization then occurs.
But how? What is this?
Okay, how?
It's magic.
That's indeed a magical part. I will fully agree. But what you see neurophysiologically is that the activation, say, of the orientation selective neuron gets changed.
Did the sound just go out? They seem confused too. Okay, so
Yeah.
they're back. All right, so
Here, I think we're back.
about the magic.
Thank you.
Right. Great. So what we see neurophysiologically is that these neurons then change their activity one depending on the other. And what we also see is that you then get new neural correlates, you might say, for example, of figure ground segregation, as we have shown. And in fact, we have, or rather, Peter Rossema has made explicit models of how these interactions work, and how indeed you can get something like figure ground organization from those interactions. So I'm not saying we are entirely understanding how this works, but there's some extent we do. So and then, and then what recurrent processing theory is claiming is that by means of these recurrent interactions, you get perceptual organization, and the perceptual organization, and that's where the magic happens, the perceptual organization is somehow critical for you to have this conscious experience. But why that is of course, entering heart problem issues and stuff, and qualia and what have you. And yeah, that's a real challenge.
But the reason why I'm making this point is because, as we also know from GNW, the neurons too. There is longer firing, for instance, in sensory areas if there is ignition from prefrontal cortex. So it's not so as much as there is a change between, say, like if you are in B1 versus B4. There is also a change if you are B1, B4, and prefrontal cortex, right? So then. And the divide here is exactly, in some sense, this. So there is something that happens when input is coming from prefrontal cortex, and then Stan says like there is consciousness, and you would say like no, this is just an extra layer that doesn't. And Steve would say this is only when the magic happens, because otherwise it just didn't mean anything. So
yeah, I had the same sort of thought when hearing your talk, Victor. The divide is somewhat artificial. When you were showing, for instance, a peak at 250 milliseconds, and you say this is due to local recurrence, it's almost certain not to be true, right? At these latencies, it's almost certain that information had plenty of time to go to prefrontal cortex and back, and perhaps several times even, right? So it's not likely to be confined to just posterior circuits then.
Yeah, but of course the key aspect of these kinds of findings is that if you take away, say, attention and access and stuff like that these recurrent interactions are still there. Like in the experiment I showed of Johannes, he had this intentional blink paradigm, and during this intentional blink, which I would say you agree gets rid of global workspace activation. Maybe not, but I think.
Well, it occupies it. It occupies the workspace.
Okay. Well, but during this attentional blink, you can still decode this perceptual grouping stuff, the kinesa versus non-kinesa.
But the subject denies they see it. So why is it not unconscious?
Yeah, well,
there is unconscious.
This is where I want to.
That's something we've discussed.
Oh, I know.
No, because I think.
But I really see this as a huge problem. Maybe you take another example. I did a lot of mathematics when I was younger, and so you do mathematics for 6 hours, and really you lose awareness of the outside world. I would claim that you lose awareness of your hunger, you lose awareness of things around you. This is really what it feels like.
Old passions.
And it's just an example. I mean, you have the same experience when you go inside a book, and it's a really bestseller, and you're totally involved into it. You claim that we're still conscious of everything around us. That's weird to me.
Yeah, but
then I think that you would agree, right?
Yeah.
So now, I will want to push this guy.
Yeah.
So why do you agree?
So they're going to let him off the hook. So they're going back to that issue. He didn't. So these things at 250 milliseconds, I guess what was Victor's claim, that they are not evidence that only local recurrency matters, but that there's still something that looks like this recurrency signal, even when the global workspace is occupied, so that it can't be contributing to that signal. I guess that was Victor's response. Of course, this gets right to the issue that they're talking about here, which is why I think that thing that you've isolated has phenomenal consciousness associated with it. I think part of the reason is that it seems commonsensical that it does. But I also see the idea that it's hard to make sense of that it does. So I'm torn on this issue. I can see both sides. So let's hear what Steve's going to say, though.
Why do I agree?
Yes.
I think
what in your explanation makes it then conscious, and why? So I will push the question to you now. So what was the magic that happened that made it conscious?
So I don't think there's magic. I think we're trying to explain a functional property here, which is our capacity to have awareness of a mental state. And so for me, being aware of that mental state is constitutive, and that's why I find higher order theory attractive as a framework within which to work. And I think if you then say we can lose that part of it and still in some weird way be conscious, I don't really feel the pull of that. I think it then becomes very hard to adjudicate. And
But
Well, I
let
have to
me.
say that we're now getting to, we're now making somewhat of a caricature of what I'm proposing here. I mean, of course, if you're so totally involved in something that, you even shut down visual cortex more or less, then I can imagine that by doing arithmetic, maybe you do. I don't know how much attention that requires. But but of course, what I'm talking about
He
is.
said arithmetic. What a dick, dude. He said I used to do a lot of mathematics when I was a kid, and this guy said you're doing arithmetic. Ooh, fuck. Okay, get it together. Oh man. Okay. Just on a side note, this happened to me. Not doing math, but I was reading a book. I was on my way to LaGuardia, where I teach. And I was on the subway, which I often am, and it was very crowded. And I was crammed in like this, and I had my book like this. And I'm one of those annoying people who's still holding the book up. And so, everyone was crammed in there. I was reading my book. It was very exciting. I think I was reading Anne Leckie. Leckie, whatever. I love those series of books of hers. Anyway, and the subway in New York, there stops. It says, 37th Street, 33rd Street, whatever. And I have to get off at 30th Street. So I'm reading my book, and I'm not really aware of the stop. And I'm, not paying attention. I'm in the book fully. And the next thing I know, I suddenly realize I'm walking, and I'm walking down the stairs. And I just realized, whoa, the train had stopped, the doors had opened, everyone got off, and I was getting off too. And I was like panicking. I was like, what stop am I at? Did I get off at the wrong stop? And no, I was off at the right stop. It was the correct stop. And I was walking down the stairs to the street. And I was like, whoa, okay, so this is the sort of thing that Stan is talking about. From my point of view, I didn't hear someone announce the street. I didn't recognize that my street had been called. I didn't realize I was walking, kind of going with the flow. I didn't realize I was changing my gait to go down the stairs. I was on the stairs when I kind of realized what was happening. Now, I think, so there's the case where it's just like, okay, clearly there's a sense in which it doesn't seem like I'm aware of these things around me. But yet I'm not falling down the stairs or bumping into people overly so. However, I think Victor's going to say, look, you're neglecting the fact that you still are aware that you're seeing stuff and hearing things. You're just not paying attention to what it is you're seeing and hearing. But it's not as though everything is black except for your experience of the book. I think that's what he's going to say.
The change blindness, inattentional blindness experiments where people do some sort of foveal task, and then in the meantime there's stuff presented
Driving,
around.
maybe.
Yeah, and that's I think that's a bit different, I would say, but okay.
Well, I agree that in the case of driving, for instance, that there's a distinction under higher order theory, because I think one thing I felt like the caricature of cognitive penetrability in respect to...
He didn't finish. He didn't go where I thought he was. I thought he was going to say it, or kind of not really doing justice to his view, because even though there's a sense in which you're unaware of that stuff, you're not totally unaware of everything. But he didn't finish that, or did I?
Higher order theory, I didn't agree with that, in the sense that somehow these higher order thoughts are heavy duty, conceptual, in working memory, and so on. I think that may have been the case for early versions where it's really a thought, but for all the other variants of higher order theory I was talking about, these are quite lean states in, say, a hierarchical model. And so I think in the case of driving, you could be thinking about
Well, so I think that this kind of plays also to one of the objections to higher order theory, is that they're very cognitively sophisticated, so maybe squirrels couldn't have them. I think squirrels could have higher states if there are such things. Possibly butterflies too. Who knows? We don't know a lot about how these get implemented, so I don't think you can tell too much from that. But certainly a traditional view is that, thoughts and stuff are very sophisticated, so only maybe adult humans have them and stuff like that. Of course, that's reading a lot into what a thought is or a concept is, which I don't think is required. But also, I don't think that these things have to be in working memory. That's optional as well. Certainly people do make that assumption often. But I think Steve's point is that if you have a view on which it's perceptual reality monitoring, that's a subpersonal system. It's not like a thought, like traditional folk psychological thought. So these more modern versions that try to implement a higher theory in a more unique way, they don't appeal to these kinds of really sophisticated sort of states like full-blown thoughts. I think that's the point Steve's trying to make.
Else in your kind of working memory and be
Steve,
dimly conscious of.
It's basically, so if you're talking about this lean representation, it's basically a representation of present versus absence, right?
So in the this is where
in your one.
Yes, exactly. In Steve's HIB model that he calls Haas, the higher order state space model, that's a particular version of that he's argued for, which is very interesting. And then we have some experiments that we're going to look at some of the differences between that and the Hakuan Lao version, and then maybe even like my version, who knows. So that's very cool, but yes, that's his version.
Like the initial, this is where...
In your one.
In our one, like the initial... so I totally agree with Stan. I feel like this is all work in progress. What's exciting here is we can write down computational models. They're very toy models. But I think that's where actually this proliferation of models, and maybe we call them theories, maybe we call them models, but that's exciting to me. That's not a problem. I think it's great that people are, just like in, say, a field like memory research, you see lots of different working computational models of various aspects of memory. That's exciting. That's the sign of a mature field. So I think that's good. But just to say, like, what that model, the original version was this idea of the higher order state, in some sense, tracking the portion of content in the first order level. But we're refining that now in later versions to be tracking the precision of the model in a particular modality. And that seems to be more powerful for explaining various features in behavioral experiments. So it's very related to this notion of perceptual confidence, is what's tracked at the higher order level.
I guess that we all agree that, in some sense, this is incremental science, right? It's not that we have the answers, we're trying to work for them. So I think we all agree on that aspect. I think the part that we don't agree, and I think this is what I'm trying to push each and every one of you, is ultimately we are doing, I published an experiment and then you interpret it one way. This is what, Victor was trying to say. So in some sense, how do we really move forward this? Because if the theories don't say the why, which is what I was trying to get from you guys, so what is this neuron that comes from prefrontal and doesn't come from basal ganglia or from the pineal gland or from somewhere else that brings that property, right? So if we don't move perhaps into that domain, or if we don't specify the computations, or if we don't specify the why we think that it's not conscious or it is conscious, and we agree on what is that line, it seems that we are going to, have a ton of results, but we will not necessarily understand them. So that's why I want to push you into trying to...
Yeah, so it's like, so I see what she's trying to say. My own view is that these questions are just going to, certain accounts are going to become able to ask more interesting questions. They're going to give rise to more interesting experiments. And the other ones are going to give rise not to do that. And they're going to give rise to less interesting questions, become stagnant. And then, people are just going to kind of lose interest in them. And then that's going to be the way that this progresses. I don't think there's going to be a magic silver bullet. I don't think you can really arbitrate with any set of experiments, because people's intuitions are just so strong. You can always dig your heels in no matter what and interpret the experiments however you want. And, looking back in history, this is how it always has been. People think it's something to do with consciousness. I would say, no, this is just how it always has been. So even with the great water debate, water is H2O, when they first took water and put the copper tube into it or whatever, and then apply electricity and show that you get a gas out one end and something else at the other end, separating the oxygen from the hydrogen. People didn't accept that experiment. They said, no, something's happening in the tube, which is introducing these things. They weren't there before. Eventually, it just fell by the wayside. This is why I sort of attracted to the view like Ned Block's, where to say that water is H2O is not something you deduce from the evidence, but it's rather something you posit to explain all the other stuff you see. That's kind of the view I hear in the background of Victor's talking here, is that we're going to identify consciousness with some neural property because it's useful in explaining all these other things. And that's the way identities are generally arrived at. even if they're counterintuitive. Now, I don't agree that we're going to arrive at this identity with it necessarily in the way that Victor's saying, but I sort of see why he's arguing in that way. On the other hand, I see also the point that's being made here as well, that any individual person will always be able to interpret things according to their own pet view, which is why I said at the beginning when I was ranting about this in the last video, I don't think we're trying to aim to convince individuals, but rather trying to build up evidence for the field, generally speaking. Yeah, okay, well, let's go ahead and finish this up.
Perhaps we can actually unify, hot theories with driving your workspace, or even perhaps with, like Victor's hypothesis. Victor's, because you could say, why can it just not reverberate in associated?
I mean,
why?
I feel like
so in some sense.
Also, I would be interested to know to what extent you would say that indeed in the driving example, you're thinking of something else and then you're driving. Are there then higher order thoughts of the driving process?
Well, what's the question?
Whether there are higher order thoughts or higher order SS, I don't know what they were, but what were the higher HOS? What was that?
States. So are there higher order states of the driving?
Are there higher order states of the driving instead of what you're thinking?
I think so I guess that would be an empirical question.
No. I'm according to a theory.
To theory. I mean, all I was trying to make...
So what's he trying to ask if, according to the higher order state-space model, Steve's theory of this, are there higher order states about the driving? Well, you're driving, but I guess the point is that you're not aware of the individual things that you're doing. You're not conscious of yourself as doing that. Well, let's hear what Steve's going to say.
There was that we're not saying the higher order state is part of working memory.
Yeah, but is it part of...
I have the same problem. Maybe I can formulate the same problem. I think I have exactly the same problem as you, Victor. Take my example of reading a good book. So you're reading Crime and Punishment. You are completely buried into it. You're seeing Raskolnikov coming. And,
I love Crime and Punishment. One of my favorite books. I don't visualize these things, but I get just because us afantastics don't have visual imagery doesn't mean we don't get lost in books. We do, and this book, I love it. It's a great book, very dramatic.
Where is the higher order state? It seems that I am in a story. The phenomenology is that, and it's the same for driving. I am in the moment. I am totally absorbed. I don't see that there is any higher order state that I'm in.
That is the higher.
That's where I think it comes apart from explicit metacognition.
Right.
So I would...
Right, so a lot of people make this mistake. So explicit metacognition is conscious and effortful. You're paying attention on purpose to your own experiences. Think about the tip of the tongue phenomena. Who was the actor in that movie? It's like, I remember their name. It was, what was it? Like you're searching, you're trying to remember. That's metacognition. That's explicit. Or maybe someone says, do you see that over there? Is that a dog or is that a fox? And you're looking out down the street and you're like, is that a dog or a fox? This happened to me the other day. My son swears that he saw a fox. I thought it was a cat. We were driving and he was like, is that a fox? I looked, I was like, I think it's a cat. It was off running down the street or whatever. We were at a stop sign. So, okay. So then you focus on it a little bit more and you're like, what was that? Anyway, I don't know why I even brought it. I forgot what I was talking about.
Say there's a difference between explicit metacognition.
Oh, right. So that's what the explicit stuff is. That means purposeful, conscious. But the kind of thing that they're talking about is implicit, not conscious, not purposeful, not done on your own, like with effort, but happens automatically. So, that the higher order state there is not one of you searching or like trying to focus on the book, although maybe that is there depending on what else is going on. But generally, when you're absorbed, the higher order state would be like, I'm in this state, the absorbed one.
/ self-awareness and awareness. And I think the higher order theories under the umbrella of what I was talking about are trying to explain the latter. Now, I think empirically it becomes interesting that they might share mechanisms, but I think they are two distinct psychological phenomena.
So while I'm driving, there should be a higher order state because I am aware of my surroundings.
So it seems to me you are in an even worse place than Victor, because you have to postulate. I'm sorry, I'm doing the pushing a little bit.
Good, that's good.
And please
That's
push
why
me
we-
back.
That's good.
But you have to postulate
Melanie
this
and
very
everyone.
high-level representation, which is not conscious, right? Where it's implicit. But what's the evidence for that in the case of these states? Yeah? Where any state where there's a flow, basically, doesn't feel at all like there is such an implicit representation.
But I think it's hard to test those cases empirically. I think that what makes the model testable is that those different levels emit a very different empirical signatures in cases where we can test them empirically. I think that I don't see a empirical way of resolving the hard cases, like the unaccessible possibility of experience. So I don't see an empirical way of resolving that, but I don't think that's a problem for the theory.
But I want to go back to Ramia's.
Maybe I'll just say one thing on that. I think that where I think we're in a better place than this. If the subject is saying they are not aware of it, and they don't have the higher order state, it's tracking the first order model.
Okay, so that means that in the driving example, they will say, well, I was not aware of the driving. They don't have a high order state of that. That's the claim then.
So,
well, hold on. So the right kind of higher order state. So there's multiple kinds of higher order states. So in my book case, when I was walking down the stairs, yes, there's no higher order representation of myself walking down the stairs. That's why I count as not experiencing it if I truly don't, according to the higher order theory. Yeah.
I would similarly like the answer of IIT on that, because I always wondered to what extent IIT thinks that these kind of phenomenal things without access or awareness actually exist. But okay. Yeah.
Well, I think that in that case, if you're really denying you were conscious of the world while you were driving, then yes. But I don't think when I drive my son to nursery and think about other things, I say I was aware of the outside world.
Melanie?
Let me bring it to Melanie, yes.
All right, so this is a good place to pause it. We've been going for a while. This is an interesting discussion, but before they switch to that topic, I guess I'll go grab something, refresh on my tea before I jump back into it.